Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday the 18th of January. I'm Cindy Yu, the Spectator's assistant editor and your host this week. Coming up on the show. After much furore, the government passed its Rwanda bill through the Commons last night. Katy Balls and Dr. Peter Walsh will give us the latest. Illegal migration isn't just a European problem. Who will fix America's border crisis? I'll speak to Lionel Shriver. Britain is a nation famous for boozing, but are we sobering up? I'll be joined by Henry Jeffreys and Giles Coren. Just over a year from becoming king, how has King Charles changed the monarchy already? Robert Hardman will join me. And finally, what are the ethics of war? I'll be speaking to moral philosopher Nigel Biggar about whether the scale of civilian deaths in Gaza is justified. Before we get going, if you enjoy Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Also, the Spectator's broadcast team is hiring. If you think you could produce this show or any of our podcasts and want to come work with us, then do apply. The deadline for applications is the 21st of January, and the link to apply is at the bottom of this video. First up, the government passed its Rwanda bill yesterday evening after Rishi Sunak faced down a group of Tory rebels. What now for the PM's flagship immigration policy? Will illegal immigrants be deported to Rwanda anytime soon? I'm joined now by Katy Balls and Dr. Peter Walsh from the Oxford Migration Observatory. Katy and Peter, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, Katy, after a lot of back and forth, Rishi Sunak has managed to pass his Rwanda bill in the Commons last night. What happened?
So once again, we had lots of talk from the potential Tory rebels about how they were willing to go further when it came to voting at third reading. Now, of course, we had this at second reading when you had the ERG, the New Conservatives, all these different groups that Mark Francois called the Five Families, having these meetings, having mini press conferences, and really trying to build it up to suggest they could vote down the bill at second reading. Of course, that didn't happen, but there was the sense that if we don't get heard in our amendments, we could actually do what we said we'd do before Christmas, and we could vote down the bill at third reading. Now, we've had various amendments to try and toughen up the bill when it comes to pushing the limits of international law or just breaking international law. And around 60 Tory MPs voted for some of these. But when it came to the third reading, and of course the amendments were unsuccessful because no one else was voting for it, so they didn't manage to change the bill. So when it came to the third reading and voting for the unamended bill, there was some talk and they were having meetings, but in the end just 11 Tory MPs voted against. So a pretty small rebellion. It was the likes of Miriam Cates, Danny Kruger from the New Conservatives, you had Suella Braverman, the former Home Secretary, you had Robert Jenrick, who'd quit as Immigration Minister over the bill, and you had Simon Clarke, who served in the Truss cabinet. I don't think any of those names are that surprising. I think they have been the ringleaders, all the people who are most keen to be critical of Rishi Sunak. What was quite interesting was Rishi Sunak has suffered resignations this week. 3 members of the payroll are gone, including Lee Anderson, who was one of his many deputy party chairmen. Now, Lee Anderson thought about voting against the bill last night and I think got near to the voting lobby, could see all the Labour politicians in there, saw them laughing and decided it was too much. And I think that tribal sense of we are a party, it's an election year, and a bill, an imperfect bill is better than no bill kicked in, and he decided not to vote against the government. So I think that's one of the reasons the rebellion was quite low in the end. And in speaking to Tory MPs today, I think there was a view of, well, those 11 MPs, they were in a voting lobby with Jeremy Corbyn, and they should reflect on that. So a small rebellion, but I would still say a bruising week for Rishi Sunak in terms of the headlines.
And the story certainly isn't over because, Peter, now the bill goes to the Lords. But first, can you remind us, how is this Rwanda bill different from the original, which the Supreme Court slapped down?
Well, the bill says to British courts, hey, the Supreme Court said that Rwanda isn't safe to send people to, but we, the government, say it is. And so you can have no regard to the facts that relate to the safety of Rwanda. We're not going to test in UK courts, again, the safety of Rwanda. That's a settled issue because the bill says Rwanda is safe.
And on the Rwandan side, there also needs to be some changes done to the laws on their side too, right?
That's right. So, and this is covered by the treaty. So the treaty, beefs up the safeguards and provides for the creation of a new initial decision-making body and a new appeals court. You'll recall that in the judgment of the Supreme Court, that was one thing they identified, which is that even though the Rwandan asylum system has an appeals process that had never been actually used in practice. But the big thing that the treaty does is it says, okay, even if people are unsuccessful in the asylum claims they file in Rwanda, Rwanda will give them permanent status. In other words, it's not going to refool anyone. It's not going to return anyone to countries from which they have fled and where they may be at risk. So that's what the treaty does, and it does require some input on the behalf of the Rwandan government. And actually, the House of Lords Committee said that treaty should not be ratified until we've seen sufficient buy-in, sufficient progress on the Rwandan side, and also perhaps that the Rwandans have done something to enhance our trust that they will comply with the terms of this beefed-up agreement.
So, Katy, a small victory for Rishi Sunak this week, but it does seem like the road to getting a first plane off to Kigali is still quite a long way.
Yes, and I think it's a victory in the sense that I think the European Research Group and the other associated groups, they look as though they're a diminished force if you compare it to the Brexit era, Theresa May, this idea that the Spartans would hold firm. And they're still saying, well, just wait, we'll be the next Spartans on this bill. But for now, at least, they just don't have the numbers. Now, I think the bigger problem for Rishi Sunak, though, is effectively, does his plan work? Because he has now refused to accept the amendments. He has ultimately said that the bill needs no changes, and he's staked a lot of his reputation on that. He's given a press conference in which he said, over to the Lords, do not disrupt the will of the people. I think there are some MPs who think it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if the Labour peers did disrupt the so-called will of the people, because then they could at least say, the reason there aren't flights to Rwanda ahead of the election is because of the Labour Party. We managed to do all our things, it's on them, what's their solution? Now, I think there is a feeling that it could well pass the Lords. At that point, you're going to get to the question of whether it works in practice. And here, if the courts are to block it, or if there are so many appeals, which has been one of the big criticisms from the right of the party, which is they're saying, the government's saying there'd only be a very small number of relevant cases that you could do individual appeals on which would be successful. The right is saying, actually, there could be lots, and you're going to get tied in that. It's going to take months, potentially years, and you're not going to be able to get a flight to Rwanda. And therefore, is it the case that this currently tiny number of rebels feel vindicated come Easter, come the summer? Or is it the case that Rishi Sunak is able to get a couple of flights off to Rwanda? And I think from the government perspective, I don't think that they think this is the perfect solution that is going to mean that they get flights en masse. I think the question is, from where they're starting from, is it one where you could get several flights to Rwanda before an election? And that's probably their best case scenario if things go right.
Right. And Peter, the other bogeyman, the other hurdle is the European Court of Human Rights, which some Tory MPs are really incensed about. Tell us about what happens if some of these deportees appeal to that court.
Yeah, which I'm sure would happen. The European Court could do what it did when the last flight was on the tarmac and issue an interim injunction. There's an open question about whether the government would ignore that. If it were to ignore it, then the court would surely hold them in breach of our international treaty obligations. But once that appeal has been sent, the European Court would be able to rule on the legality of the policy as a whole and whether it is compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights, and that could potentially scupper the entire policy. By that stage, people might have been sent to Rwanda, but if the European Court of Human Rights were to say, actually, this is in conflict with the European Convention, then we would have to take those people back.
And now, Katy, we've heard that Rishi Sunak is not very keen on directly contravening the ECHR. So is he just hoping that this will be a can that he's kicking down the road, and then maybe by that time a flight's gone off, but the elections also started anyway?
Yeah, I think this is about what can you do in the time between now and polling day, from where you start from. In the press conference after the bill's passed third reading, Rishi Sunak was asked about these Section 39 orders from the ECHR and whether he would actually use the powers in the bill to ignore them. And he said, of course I'm willing to, that's why it's in the bill. But then he was pressed on, well, in what circumstances would you be willing to ignore them? And that's where I think there's less clarity. So depending on where you sit in the party and, of course, in the country, your version of when that should be ignored could be different than what ministers would really do. And I think that's one of the things you won't know until it is in operation, if you get to that point. And I think that is one of the areas where I think, it's just the proof will be in the pudding if he gets to the point where the government is in a position to choose what to do.
And Katie and Peter, so the Rwanda scheme, planes getting off the tarmac and into Kigali, not something you'd put money on?
The government's own lawyers, I believe, have given it a coin toss by the next election. There are so many moving parts, I can't really improve on that. Yeah,
I think it's one where in government, I don't think there is a certainty. And you saw that in Rishi Sunak's press conference when he was said, do you still think it is, can you guarantee that you will have a flight to Rwanda for the election? He didn't say that he could guarantee it because ultimately he can't. I think that they're ultimately trying to get to a point where they can say, well, we've done so much to try and get there that even if they don't, you can say, well, we've done more than Labour, more than others. You can't say we haven't tried. I think one of the problems with the rebel movement this week is even some in his own party think he hasn't gone far enough. So for Rishi Sunak, the only, I think, way out of this is for there to be at least, a handful of flights to Rwanda. Otherwise, his own party are going to turn around and say, well, maybe you should have listened to some of the figures that were telling you to do things differently.
Katy Balls and Dr. Peter Walsh, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. Next, is America having an, albeit very small, civil war? Columnist Lionel Shriver writes in this week's magazine about a standoff between the Texas National Guard and the US Border Patrol. Illegal immigration is causing more and more problems in the Republic, she writes. To tell us about it, Lionel joins me now. Lionel Shriver, welcome to Spectator TV.
Nice to talk to you again.
Now, Lionel, it's almost a cliche these days to say that America is divided, but in your column this week, you literally look at a state that is defying the federal government and using force to do it. Tell us about what's going on in Texas.
Well, I defined it as a tiny civil war because it is really about a state refusing to get with the program in relation to the federal government. It's a point of consternation with border states that the federal government is not doing its job in policing the southern border of the United States. And Governor Greg Abbott in Texas has decided to take matters into his own hands. And in one tiny place, he has sent in the Texas National Guard, which, despite the sound of it, is a state militia, to take over Eagle Pass. There's a park in Eagle Pass. It's a little town of only 29,000 people, but one that regularly receives something like on an average of 12,000 migrants per day, which is astonishing. So Abbott has sent his militia in to take over this territory and a little bit more on the sides to try to stop illegal immigration in that particular area. I doubt it's very effective. I think that they're not very successful in stopping people from coming in, and they have nothing to do with these people but to turn them over to the border force that they're keeping out. So it may just add an extra administrative level. It seems symbolic to me. It's a gesture of rebellion, circa 1860.
and the federal government is taking the governor, or at least the state, to courts, right? I mean, they're fighting this out in the judiciary. But it's not even the first time that Greg Abbott has fought the federal government in the courts.
Oh, no, this is ongoing. And Texas put up these floating buoys in the Rio Grande to just try to stop people from swimming to the American bank of the river. And DC sued to have them removed. because it's the border between two countries, and that is a federal matter. DC is also suing to cut the concertina wire that Texas has put on the banks of that river to prevent people from landing and crawling into the United States. What's especially weird about this conflict is that you would think that the federal government and the state of Texas would be on the same side. I mean, why aren't both parties interested in controlling the flow of illegal immigration into the United States? It's structurally and politically bizarre.
Well, for British viewers who might be more thinking about the European migrant crisis and not know so much about the US side, you've kind of hinted at it already, but just how severe are we talking about when we talk about this illegal migration problem?
Well, I hate to boggle our viewers' minds, but it's way worse than Europe, right? The scale of it is astonishing. So it's estimated that between 8 and 10 million illegal immigrants have entered the United States since Biden took office. And that's not an accident. That's not just a coincidence. And you know, that's a significant swelling of a population of about 330 million people. And that it's putting enormous strain on not just border states, but now northern cities like New York and Chicago, which simply don't have the means of handling this many newcomers without any resources. It's costing a fortune. New York City in particular is in a quandary because not only has it declared itself a sanctuary city, which means they don't enforce immigration laws. It's another kind of tension between the feds and other local authorities. But it's also got a so-called right to shelter. And that means that they are legally obliged to put up anybody who doesn't have a home. And they have been applying the right to shelter to not only New Yorkers who become homeless, but also just anybody who rocks up. I wish I'd known that when I was scraping as a postgraduate student. Would have saved me a lot of money. I don't understand how this continues because it will. There's no end in sight of this flow of people. There are now 68,000 people in the New York shelter system. They've completely run out of room. They've actually had to cut back on the budgets of all the other major departments in order to finance what I understand is $400 per night per household, and by household that includes single adults. A single adult will make up a household. I mean, most normal Americans couldn't afford that, and it's just astonishing. You know, as much as I hate to say this, the only thing that is credibly going to bring a stop to this is the election of Donald Trump.
Gosh, and Lionel, I know how much it would pain you to say that.
It pains me fantastically.
Why do you think he will succeed? Because looking at his first presidency, after reading your piece, I did have a look at how successful he was, but he failed to get illegal migration down when he was president the first time round. ICE actually deported, in 2020, the fewest people ever deported since 2003 when the agency was set up. Isn't it just a pretty intractable problem?
It's incredibly intractable. And it comes down to problems with the law and outdated immigration statutes. This is the same in Europe, right? So the U.S. has signed up to the same kind of asylum policy that Europe has been pursuing, and it's ruinous. And the weird thing is that most of the people who are being let in and are allowed to apply for asylum don't qualify, even under very loose definitions of a legitimate asylum claim. But in the United States, and this is not that different from a lot of places in Europe, including Britain, there's such a backlog that if you've applied, you may be getting a court date 5 years from now, even 10 years from now, which is going to give these people, assuming they show up for the court date, which is a big question, it's going to give them grounds for remaining permanently because they will have established, households, probably had children who are American citizens, So while the admission is temporary, we know better. It's not temporary.
But why would Trump be able to solve it better?
I think he will at least change the rhetoric. And I have to apologize for my tense, because I should have said he might, because we don't know that he's going to be elected president. So, but in let's say he is elected, he will put up a lot of bluster, and there's certainly going to be a fear on the migrant side that he talks such a hard line. All these people don't know the statistics, right? Talks such a hard line that it's important to get in while Biden is still president. In fact, that's one of the fears on the administrative front, that the more it looks as if Trump might get in, then there's going to be a big push for the border. And the irony of that is that it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of the presidency, because as I note in the column, this is one of the determinants of who wins the election. There's a huge anger in the country over the kind of images that are coming up, coming from the border, and it is changing people's votes on a widespread level. I mean, I'm not statistically supported here, but I read a lot of comments, and the number of lifelong Democrats that I encounter in the New York Times who claim that because of this issue alone, they're going to vote Republican. That number is huge, and so I think that an even further surge could easily push Trump over the line.
That's fascinating, Lionel, and we'll be sure to stay on the story throughout the election year. Thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. In this week's cover piece, writer Henry Jeffries laments the decline of boozy Britain. What does it mean for a country's health and economy if we're all drinking less? And what vices are young people replacing alcohol with? Henry joins me now with the Times restaurant critic, Giles Coren. Henry and Giles, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, Henry, it is January, so it's probably a good time to be talking about this new trend that you've identified, that Britain is sobering up. Tell us about what's happening.
Yeah, well, the young people just aren't keeping up their side of the bargain. They're meant to start drinking at 14 or even earlier because there's not much else to do. And the signs are that they're just not doing that. Something like a quarter of young people are teetotal or say that they're teetotal. The rest of them are more concerned with, looking beautiful, drinking water, going to the gym, all that kind of stuff, than sitting in parks, drinking cider and smoking Benson and Hedges. So it was just a kind of a sort of middle-aged man's cry of what are the young people doing? That's what it's all. But it's not just young people. Older people are drinking less as well. So it's just about how the whole country is sobering up.
Like Henry, I'm a man of a certain age, and excoriating the young is part of my bread and butter. But normally we whinge about how or historically, it's about the young being feckless and given to booze and drugs and shagging and nothing productive and not knuckling down. In our day, not our day quite, but our parents' day, one did national service and helped old ladies across the road and had a general sense. Henry, you seem to be lamenting the fact that they're all terribly well brought up and sweet and kind and all the kinds of things our parents wanted us to be, while we were down the bike sheds, chasing the dragon and swilling Hofmeister.
I don't know what you were doing. Yeah, you went to slightly different schools than me. We were just smoking cigarettes. Yeah, do you know? In some ways, I actually think that they have it slightly better, because we were, so there wasn't that much else to do in the 80s apart from sit around and drink cider. I mean, I went to boarding school, and I was rubbish at sports. If you didn't play sport, drinking and smoking were about the only two things you could do. Whereas I think young people nowadays have vastly more things to do, most of them on their phones, and they can meet the opposite sex online. They don't have to go to sticky floored nightclubs called Visage or Kudos to get on with the opposite sex.
But you are lamenting the passing of something, though, in your excellent article, aren't you? You're saying that there is something. Our way of life is not threatened. You and I can go and get wankered in the pub till we die, very happily doing the crossword and eating pork scratch and going outside for a fag and coming back in for a shot and a chaser. So what the kids are doing is not threatening us, but you're sort of worried that they are losing something by not drinking.
Yeah, I think they are. I think there's a lot of spontaneous, interesting and fun things happen when you add alcohol and perhaps put down your mobile phone. And also I worry, and this is probably another slightly middle-aged man thing, that the kind of institutions that we take for granted, the kind of local pub, sort of good quality wine available reasonably cheaply, need a healthy and widespread drinking culture to support them. And if drinking becomes a minority pursuit, then pubs will close, and the price of wine and whiskey and all the sort of things we love will go up even more than it's going up already.
Well, when landlords and the sort of the pub, I was in the pub for lunch only an hour ago, and talking actually to the landlord about a favourite pub of ours, the Devonshire in Devon Street in Soho, which has just been reopened by a legendary landlord, Osh Rogers, and is doing fantastically well and shipping out loads and loads of Guinness, and it's a great pub success story in an environment in which basically a quarter of pubs, I think in your piece it said, have shut since whenever it was, 2012, 2013. A lot of that was said to be to do with taxation rules and duty rules and booze becoming very cheap in supermarkets, and people who really want to drink go and drink in a supermarket. And the loss of pub culture is a slightly separate thing, isn't it, than from the actual people actually not getting bladdered anymore?
I don't know. I think the sort of getting bladdered is a slightly sort of side thing. It's more just the kind of regular drinking, rather than having drink as part of your everyday life rather than something unusual.
And isn't it the case both that it's not that the young are necessarily turning away from alcohol for healthier pursuits? You talk about drinking water, sure, going out for walks, fine, but some of them are turning to things like vaping, things like weed we've already mentioned, and I know anecdotally some young people who do lots of hard drugs but think that they don't want to mix that with alcohol because God forbid. So it's not necessarily better.
Yeah, it's the ones that I know, and I work in a kind of I use a sort of shared office space in Soho, and so there are quite a lot of young people around, or youngish, and people in their 20s and 30s. It's not, they don't seem to be they don't do heroin and coke and stuff so much as the hallucinogenics. They're the thing that they think is great. That's the thing. And I'm talking about people in their late 20s, early 30s, professional. There's a fellow, I better not give him his real name, but there's an old Etonian who's working on a history book at this thing. He's a fantastic fellow, sort of tall and handsome with a long beard, and the other night he was off to, he was going to Evensong at St Paul's on shrooms, and he and a couple of friends, that's what they were doing. They were going to do a load of shrooms, and then he reported back the next day he'd done too many shrooms and had to leave because it was too freaky, and he had to go home, and he was going to chill and then go back to St Martin in the Fields for some Vivaldi, where he was going to do a spot of Molly, which I believe is what they call ecstasy, but in sort of small doses while listening to classical music. And it's sort of, on the one hand, way more daring than us, on the other hand, pathetically square.
Yeah. Do you remember that summer? This is slightly off the point. Do you remember the summer where every single head shop in Camden suddenly realised that mushrooms weren't technically illegal? I think it was like 2003. And they all started selling magic mushrooms, but as ornaments. So they would say, here are these magic mushrooms. They are, do not eat them. These are purely ornamental. And it lasted about 6 months before people cracked down on the loop. I know this is totally irrelevant, but it was a very funny summer. 2003, I think.
People who are into drugs, even when I was young, so it's not fair, man, it's Babylon. Booze is legal, but cannabis is illegal for no reason apart from white people having control, whatever. And you think, I know what they mean, but booze is so woven into everything we do. And as a restaurant critic, I just can't not drink it. Even if I were doing dry drink, even when I've tried to give up alcohol, I feel so weird and wrong and party poopy in a restaurant because it's woven into what we do and not scary at all, is it? Whereas the drugs seem to be other, and you're sort of worried there might be a shift where booze ceases to occupy this role that it always has.
Well, that's the thing. I think you just hit the nail on the head. I think things like restaurants, pubs, bars are places where you have basically controlled environments for intoxication. So if you want to take yourself out of reality slightly, rather than taking shrooms and perhaps taking too many and missing your drugged up evensong, you go to the pub and you drink your carafe of Malbec or your pint of bitter and stuff. And as long as you stay off like the Jägermeister shots, you can kind of control how much you drink quite well. Once you reach a certain age, obviously when I was 16, I couldn't do that. But, by the time I got to 30, I was pretty good at measuring how much I could drink. And you have this environment and this culture, or, like a wine tasting, for example. People go to wine tastings, they pretend it's about the bouquet and the terroir and the soil. It's not. It's just a sociable way of getting drunk in a sort of slow and controlled way. And I think if people aren't drinking and you're not having the younger generation coming through, that kind of thing will eventually die out.
I think you're right. Those kind of social establishments would die out. But on the point about control, as I hear it anecdotally, there's all about microdosing these days. There are these milligram scales that tell you exactly how much you're taking, purity tests that tell you exactly how pure the stuff you're taking is. So that control thing is also changing as that market changes. Now, I want to ask you both, what do you think about the alcohol-free stuff, like the alcohol-free beers that pubs are adapting to, the alcohol-free bars that are totally alcohol-free but pretend to be proper bars? Do you hate them? What do you think?
I've never been to an alcohol-free bar. The whole idea just makes me feel so sad. I don't have any problem with alcohol-free drinks. I just think at some point I'm going to want to have something with alcohol in, because the reason I drink beer is because I like the taste of it, but also because it makes me feel like I've just had some beer. So while I actually quite like some alcohol-free beers and do actually drink things like Adnams, Ghost Ship and stuff on occasion, the idea of a totally non-alcoholic bar, I wouldn't go.
I think I feel similarly. I mean, I don't fancy an alcohol-free bar. I don't really like ersatz products. It's like I did not drink for about a year once, and by the time I've also tried being vegan. And when I was trying being vegan, it's fine if you eat fruit and vegetables. If you eat that sort of fake bacon they eat or their veggie burgers, it's disgusting. And this was about 10 years ago, and my wife was pregnant with our second child. And I thought, I'll see what happens if I don't drink. And it was sort of marvellous, and I did drink. Then it wasn't so good. It was Beck's Blue, which was disgusting, but then Beck's is so disgusting that the gap was kind of small, but it had a terrible sort of aftertaste. There were a couple of Weiss beers that were okay. But what I needed, and this was about a year I did it, what I needed was, I don't have a sweet tooth. I don't have there's something you've got to drink. And with a meal, you just can't. I can just about drink a Diet Coke on a hot day, but I couldn't with a meal. And water doesn't do a job. So you need something which sort of, I always use the phrase lazily. Oh, we had a marvelous Chablis that cut through the grease, and it's a thing that restaurant critics say, but it is sort of true. You have to kind of clean off your tongue with something that isn't sugary, some sort of drinky thing. And I found most of the ersatz thing ridiculous. It was an awakening not drinking for a year, and I was thinking about it when I was reading Henry's piece. At the beginning, I couldn't believe how much of my life I got back. I'd look in my diary, and generally speaking, if I look in my diary now, it'll say Wednesday afternoon, lunch with Bob. Right, well, I won't do anything Wednesday night and probably not much for Thursday morning. That's a write-off. Thursday night, dinner with the so-and-sos. Yeah, well, Friday, I'm going to have a terrible hangover, so I can't do anything then. You look at weekends. Oh, God, I've got to take my son to football. But the night before, I'm going to be absolutely steaming. And then when all that was taken out, the days were incredibly long. And I got more done. I wrote a book, part of a book. Yeah, I got also, the days were just long. And no day was a write-off. The weeks were long. You could loads of stuff. You felt amazing. And then the weeks got too long. And then I discovered there wasn't actually that much to do. And it would get to a Thursday and I'd have done everything I needed to do for the whole month. And I was wide awake. And I think, God, I need to be pissed now. And that was in the end the thing that I went back to. And I think that is the role that it fills, is we don't have, particularly journalists. I mean, I used to, in the 90s on Fleet Street, we used to drink and drink and drink. And it was because Henry knows there's not that much to do, right? Writing a piece takes a couple of hours, but in the days when you went to an office, you had 8 hours to fill. So you get in, go to a conference, write a paragraph, do your intro, then go to the pub for 3 hours and get battered, come back at 4. And then it's exciting trying to get it done by 5:30 when you can hardly see with one hand over your eye and the keyboard. And that's the whole profession sort of built up around that. Take away the booze and you can hardly say papers are more interesting now, are they? I don't know what they're doing.
Well, I think we're spending a lot more time on Twitter and YouTube nowadays. Giles and Harry, I'm afraid I've got to leave it there, but thank you so much. Such a pleasure to have you on the show. Royal journalist Robert Hardman writes all about the new look monarchy in this week's Spectator. Charles is a keen mushroom picker, he says, and Prince William is planning to shorten his own coronation service to just over an hour, down from his father's 2. To tell us all about it, Robert joins me now. Robert Hardman, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, you've got a new book out, Charles III, New King, New Court. And before we go into all of that, I mean, we've also found out this week that the King has come down with some health issues, as well as Kate. So what do we know about what's happening?
Well, yes, it's been quite an unusual start to the year in that in the space of a few hours, it was announced, firstly by Kensington Palace, that the Princess of Wales is in hospital recovering from surgery and will stay there for a couple of weeks. That will probably be out of action up until Easter. And the King is going for a routine operation next week in connection with an enlarged prostate, and will be out of action for a few days. So, I mean, there's nothing to particularly worry about, but I mean, the fact that both these announcements came so close together, I think is a reminder of actually, we hear a lot about the so-called slim down royal family, and two absolutely key players are now going to be out of action for a while.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we wish them all the best, and I'm sure they'll be back in action soon enough. Yeah,
we wish them all the best. Now, Robert, you talk about this new king and this new court, and you talked about the slim down monarchy as well. What mark has King Charles made on the monarchy so far? He's only been in position for 1 year.
Well, it's been an extraordinary year and a bit, hasn't it? And I think a lot of people at the start, a lot of his critics particularly, were sort of voicing fears that he might be a bit of a loose cannon. He might overstep the mark. He might sort of speak out too much. And actually what we've seen is a very sure-footed, confident and crucially happy. This is the thing, he's a happy monarch. I found this while I was writing my book and following him around. He's very kind of content in the position. And it's I think now, as going as well as anyone would have dared to expect, because there was a lot of talk about how do you follow on from the most revered and record-breaking monarch of all time. I mean, Elizabeth II was adored and enormous shoes to fill. And yet he's done it. And I think he's surprised people because he hadn't really talked about it much while he was Prince of Wales, largely because he just felt it was inappropriate. And there hadn't been any kind of jostling for position. He was very content with his role as Prince of Wales, and he adored his mother, and that was that. But the time came, he's taken it on. And so I think possibly what has not necessarily helped the monarchy, but has certainly enhanced the idea of the monarchy as being a sort of stable force of continuity, is just a sort of madness of the political situation. So, in the same time, as we all remember, there was that week where we had, effectively, we had 2 prime ministers and 2 monarchs in the space of 3 days. Yeah. And yet it was the royal part of the equation which has been thoroughly solid and steadfast. The political side, of course, has been all over the place and still is.
Yeah, and when you talk about this happy monarch and how you went to Balmoral as well, one particular tidbit I think we can say from that is him foraging for mushrooms. Tell us about that. So the king goes into the forest and picks his own mushrooms.
He is a mushroom picking king. He loves picking mushrooms. I think he loves planting trees, and he likes gathering fruit and mushrooms and whatever the time of year, but particularly in the autumn he's very keen on picking mushrooms. And as I say in the book, I mean, on the day the Queen died, he had He'd managed to fly up, been to see her, been to her bedside. He'd gone back to his home at Burke Hall, a few miles away, for a few hours. Nobody knew at that point that the Queen was going to decline as rapidly as she did. And he was out in the grounds picking mushrooms. And as I say in this week's Spectator Diary, and in my royal notebook, when the Sunaks came to stay, and every year it's a tradition that the Prime Minister and spouse come up for a weekend, usually in the autumn, to stay at Balmoral, and I happened to be there because I was researching my book and my TV programme, and so watched them arrive, and we went for a walk in the grounds with the King and Queen, and it was actually it was very nice weather. It was sort of rather charming late summer's weekend. And at one point the King just disappeared to go and pick mushrooms for his guests. And I think everybody thought that's a very nice gesture. Although, as I say in Spectator this week, one or two people think, is that such a good idea? Should the monarch actually be picking mushrooms for the Prime Minister? Because, if things went wrong, and it has been known, and I have mentioned in my piece that, occasionally there are these terrible accidents where somebody picks the wrong thing, and you could end up in a very serious situation. So, as one Privy Councillor said to me, just imagine, you could have lost the King, the Queen, and also staying with some eminent friends, including the Provost of Eton. So, I just raised the question of, should they all eat the same thing? Yeah. To which I think the answer is yes, of course they should, but it's quite an interesting thesis.
Well, I assume he knows his mushrooms.
He does.
And rather explosively in the book, you also reveal that the Queen was not at all happy about the naming of Harry and Meghan's daughter, Lilibet, which is the Queen's nickname. And that's not what we'd heard before. Harry had said that she was supportive.
It wasn't
of that
actually.
name.
It wasn't the naming of their daughter Lilibet that was the issue. It was the handling of the story that then unfolded, because they'd let it be known that she supported it. It was basically put around that she'd given it her blessing, and then the BBC reported, no, that's not what happened. She wasn't asked. And there was a sort of big tussle between the Beeb and the Sussexes team. And then the Sussexes issued legal proceedings and went to the palace and said, well, you'll back up our version of events. At which point there was a resounding silence, because we don't know precisely who said what to whom, but this idea that the Queen had given her blessing clearly did not sit with the palace. And the Queen she loves Harry, she loves Lilibet, that's unchanged, but no one rearranges the Queen's words, if you like. No one says that the Queen said something if she didn't. And that was the source of the anger, the fact that the Queen was being asked to, shall we say, endorse a version of events that was not, in her view, what happened. And in the book, I just say it's another case of her, probably one of her most famous lines of her long reign: recollections may vary.
And presumably she was uncomfortable with the force of the law that the Sussexes brought with that, the threat of suing, considering her
we don't know.
palace
We
has
don't.
never
I don't.
complained,
I don't. This is a book on Charles III. It's not a book on the Sussexes. It was an interesting discovery. I think possibly we can all overread, too much into it, and after all, we are dealing with, who said what to whom, in what order, some time ago. But there's absolutely no question that the Queen and the palace were very unhappy with the way the subsequent story was handled. That was the root cause of the row.
You talk about the political turbulence over the last year. It's not just been political, because in the royal family there's also been a lot of turbulence, not least coming from Harry and Meghan's direction. How has King Charles dealt with that? The publication of Spare, the 6-part Netflix documentary, all in his first year of being monarch, his youngest son. That's pretty tough.
It was an extraordinary start to a reign, really, that in the space, as I say in the book, it was a 3-month concentrated period of pretty negative headlines on a weekly, if not daily basis. Don't forget, you also had another series of The Crown coming out, and that wasn't particularly helpful either. So you had The Crown juggernaut going in October of 22. Very soon after that, you had the Sussexes' own 6-part Netflix series and all the attendant publicity that went with that. And as soon as that over, then we were into the whole sort of Spare production with the interviews ahead of the publication of Spare, as Harry's book was called, which was a huge global bestseller. So all that's happened in a fairly concentrated period. right at the start of his reign. And you might think, well, that's a pretty difficult start. But actually, what he did, he just got on with it. There was no fight back. There was no sort of counter briefing. We in the press, I think, would have liked to have heard more noise coming from the other direction, particularly from the Duke of, the Prince of Wales, from Prince William, who clearly was very hurt by a lot of this stuff. But the decision was, we're just going to get on with the job. We're going to ride this out. We're not going to do any sort of briefing. And it just sort of passed. And I think the reason that it passed is that while people obviously desperate to read, Harry's book and his Netflix series did very well, I don't think it's really changed anyone's perceptions or views on the monarchy. If you were a Sussex diehard, you're more diehard than ever. You feel absolutely pumped up by this stuff. If you were a Sussex critic, you thought, oh, look at them, there they go again. I think most people, the majority of people, are just in between. They just think, well, we have heard this story before. I think, the fact that Harry and Meghan were not very happy being royal, I think we kind of got that message. Got that message a year ago, maybe 2 years ago. And they've now been in their royal existence as a royal couple, it was something like 600 or 700 days. They've now been in a post-royal existence for well over 1,000 days. So, that the story can only be told so often, and I think we've sort of heard it.
And the monarchy has escaped relatively unscathed under new king.
And you ask, what's the king's view on all this? And I think we in the media are sort of slightly guilty of constantly thinking he must, lie awake at night, always thinking about the dramas of, with a Harry, with a Andrew. And actually, there's just so much else goes on when you're a monarch. There's just all the day-to-day stuff of, what a minister's doing, who needs to be appointed to the Privy Council, what state visits are coming up, where do I need to go, which regiments haven't I visited for the last year. It's a lot of unresolved royal baggage that needs to be sorted out this year, and sorted out quite quickly. There's a whole issue of the patronages. All the patronages effectively got put on hold following the death of the Queen, and there's been this huge reorganisation going on, and that has yet to be announced. The whole issue of royal warrants. You've got literally hundreds, if not thousands, of hundreds of companies employing thousands of people for whom having a royal warrant is a very important imprimatur. It's what is key to their a lot of their sort of marketing strategy. They want to know, well, what's happening with our warrants, and all these things. They get done very carefully. I suppose it goes back to the point of who said what, and why the palace takes the who said what to whom very, very seriously. Is everything has to be done very precisely. They don't want any loose ends. So all these various strands of royal life in a new reign have got to be resolved, and that's in some cases, many cases, that has yet to happen. So he's got a lot on his plate, which is why, if from time to time there is, there are more grumblings from Montecito, well, there we are.
Robert Hardman, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. And finally, can a war be just if lots of civilians die? Oxford University's Nigel Biggar writes about this in a magazine this week. In war, civilian suffering can be moral and legal, he says. Nigel joins me now. Nigel Biggar, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, for anyone watching the war unfold in Gaza, I think they would be horrified by the scale of the civilian destruction. But you write in the magazine this week that its horrific scale doesn't tell us anything about its morality or its legality. Tell us about that.
No, you're quite right. The scale of human suffering in Gaza is awful. But the fact is that war involves a lot of tragic human suffering. The laws of war do not prohibit the killing of lots of civilians. The laws of war prohibit the intentional killing of civilians and the disproportionate killing. That's to say, killing that is not necessary to achieve an important military objective. And the reason that the laws of war are permissive in that way is because you can't fight a war successfully without risking civilian casualties often, and certainly during the Second World War the Allies caused grievous harm to civilians, not because they wanted it, not because they intended it, but because there was no other way of fighting the Nazis effectively.
So you're saying if you think that war needs to happen, then civilians sometimes need to die?
I'm afraid so. Not in every case, but usually that is the case. I mean, if you're a pacifist, then of course no casualties, military or non-military, are acceptable morally. If you're not a pacifist, then you're going to have to accept there will be a lot of tragic deaths.
And the World War II example is really interesting. I didn't realise until reading your piece just how much civilian lives were lost. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so most people in the West, certainly in the English-speaking West, think that the war to defeat genocidal Nazism in Europe was morally justified. But a conservative estimate has it that Allied, that's to say British and American bombers, killed around 350,000 German civilians. Now that's controversial, of course, because the British, particularly under bomber Harris, may have deliberately intended to kill German civilians, which was immoral. But they didn't intend to kill 70,000 French civilians, which is what happened in France during the Second World War and during the crucial Normandy campaign, the invasion of Normandy in 1944. Around 30,000 French civilians were killed. Why was that? Because the Allies depended very heavily on the use of bombers and artillery, and they didn't have the precise technology that allowed them to target precisely. They didn't want to kill civilians, but they couldn't avoid it. The alternative was to expose troops on the ground to greater risks. The problem was that as early as 1943, the British were running out of men. So it was felt that the priority is to defeat Nazism, and we have to take risks with civilians.
But that's the moral grey area, isn't it? I mean, I can see why intention is very important, but isn't there also a point about negligence? You know, are you, as an army, doing all that you can to minimise civilian casualties, or are you valuing your own soldiers' lives more than that of civilians? And where does that ratio start to become very questionable?
Well, I mean, one has to put it to the likes of the Israeli Defence Force in Gaza. Are you really being as careful with civilian lives as you possibly can? That's a fair question to put. The answer has to come in terms of the circumstances. There's no, as it were, general rule here. The question is, what is it you're trying to achieve militarily? What means are you using? Could you use means that would expose civilians to fewer risks? Is this military objective really important? But depending on the answer could be we can't minimise civilians any further, and we have to pursue this military objective even at the cost of considerable civilian casualties.
I think it's fair to say that the world is watching this conflict. You know, so many countries in the developing world are very concerned about this, and that's why South Africa has recently brought a genocide case against Israel. Yes. But they're raising this kind of questions, aren't they? We can't just take the IDF's word for saying that they're minimising things. What happened on October 7th was so deeply traumatic for them. There has to be questions raised by impartial people outside of Israel.
No, absolutely. But in order for a criticism of Israel to be cogent, in order to make the case that Israel has intentionally targeted civilians, in order to make the case that the exposure of civilians to harm has been disproportionate or genocidal, you need to have military experts who understand military operations. You also need to have people who know the facts on the ground. But granted military expertise and granted knowledge of what's going on the ground, yes, questions need to be put to Israel, as to any country that is waging war. But as for genocide, I mean, you're right. South Africa has brought a case of genocide against Israel in the International Criminal Court. But I think it will fail because the 1948 Genocide Convention stipulates that genocide takes place when there is an intention to destroy a people in whole or in part as such, right? So the idea has to be that Israel wants to exterminate Palestinians, not that Israel is risking Palestinian civilians in the course of pursuing military objectives against Hamas. And if there is evidence of genocidal intent, then let's see it. I don't know there is any such evidence.
And Nigel, what about a duty to find non-military solutions? You know, obviously Israel was thrown into this conflict by the attack of October 7th, but can we really say that Israel has exhausted all non-military options to solve the Palestinian problem before October 7th? And doesn't that have implications on how just this war is?
No, that's a really important point, Cindy. So I think Israel is justified in its immediate military reaction to October 7. Israel has to defend its people against indiscriminately murderous violence. But in the long term, Israel's military operations have to be part of a larger strategy for peace. And I don't know what that is. About 10 years ago, there was a film released called The Gatekeepers. It was actually quite riveting, although it only comprised talking heads. But the talking heads were of grizzled Israeli security, senior security chiefs. And one after another, they said, we're in the business of preempting terroristic violence and stamping on fires, and we can keep on doing that till the cows come home, but what's the strategy? Yeah. And they said there is none. This was 10 years ago. And my sense is Israel doesn't have a strategy for peace other than simply containing Hamas in Gaza and undermining the Palestinian Authority. So whereas I think the short-term military action of Israel is justified, the question of prolonged military operations purporting to achieve a final permanent solution to the problem, that has to be part of a larger strategy which involves non-military means. And I think Israel needs to be asked what that strategy is.
Well, the thing that reminded me of was Israeli President Isaac Herzog said last year, he said that there were no such thing as innocent civilians in Gaza, that it's entirely a nation out there that is responsible. I mean, that's the kind of thing that would demonstrate that at least the civilian militant distinction is not drawn by Israel in the same way that maybe international observers are drawing it.
Well, I mean, to some extent the President is correct in that, particularly in the case of an insurgency such as Hamas's recent operations are, precisely because insurgents hide themselves or mix themselves up with civilians, it's very hard to distinguish. Nevertheless, notwithstanding that, it's still the case that Israel needs to focus on destroying Hamas or disabling Hamas and not exterminating Palestinian people. So I think that distinction still needs to be made. Whatever, it's very hard to judge to what extent this civilian or that civilian is involved militarily with Hamas. Some will be, some will not be. You certainly can't say that all Palestinians are colluding in Hamas's warfare.
Well, Nigel, I think this is the crux of the issue here. I mean, it's such a horrific conflict and nobody wants to see the destruction, but this is absolutely the crux of the moral issue. So thank you so much for joining Spectator TV.
Thanks for having me on.
That's it for this week. Once again, if you enjoy Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Thanks again for watching and do join us next week.